Hello, this video will provide a basic introduction to web controls and event handling in ASP.NET. In terms of our development environment, we're using Visual Studio 2010 Express, and we're working with a very basic web application relying on the C# programming language. What you see in front of you is a basic ASPX file called Postback demo that I just created. It has a code behind file. So the first thing you see is the presentation file, and we're in design mode right now, but you can also go to source mode and see the mix of server-side markup and client-side HTML that comprises that file. And then in our code behind file, when I double click on it, you can see the C# class that forms the backbone for our actual page. To get started, let's focus on the basic concepts of designing a page in ASP.NET. Under design mode, you can work with your toolbox to drag and drop controls to build a page. So what we're going to do in our example is create a drop-down list. So I'll just make a label. We'll call it select your favorite season. And when you notice when I'm saying I create a label, I just click in the page and type. And then behind the scenes, it just puts text inside the div tag. But in terms of receiving a web control to work with, I'm going to click drop-down list in my toolbox, drag it into the page, and I now have a drop-down list. And you can see there are some helper menus that automatically appear. One concept is enable auto postback. What auto postback provides for you is when it's checked, anytime a user in the web browser makes a selection from that drop list, it issues a postback to the server, which is where our C# code would invoke again, and we could react to whatever selection the user made. We're going to opt to not enable auto postback, meaning that any action on the web browser side in HTML and JavaScript will not be replied or provided to the server until some other event results in a server postback, like a button click. With that said, I'm going to click beside this control, hit enter, and drag a button in. Now, I could set the button's properties in the properties panel of Visual Studio, but instead let's do it in the source view of the design page. So what you see now is an ASP button, and it has an ID tag. That's really vital because that's where you rely or interact with the control in C#. So I'm going to call it button submit, and it runs at the server, which any web control has to do, and the text I'm going to change from button to submit. And then also you'll see the drop-down list control. It has an ID of drop-down list 1. It's usually recommended to specify, actually it's always recommended to specify your own control names, just so as you develop a more and more complex page you can keep track of what everything even is. So I'm going to call it DDL season. This is a older notation style. It's actually called Hungarian notation, and this is where you prefix a variable name with a 3-digit code that represents, like in this case, drop-down list. It can be your own scheme, but at least that way you can maintain some concept of what your objects are when you're working in code. Now you'll notice that if you're familiar with HTML, these tags don't correlate to HTML. This drop-down list itself would actually create dynamic HTML on the client side, so we're working on server-side concepts right now. This is a server-side script that will generate dynamic HTML depending on what happens in your code. If we were going to write just regular HTML, which we could do in the same file, we can mix these, it would actually be more of a select tag with option tags between. And that's how you build a drop-down list in HTML. The same with the button. That would actually be an input type of button. So now that we have our server-side controls, we can start to look at event handler. An event handler is nothing more than a code block that controls what happens on the server side when you initiate a postback from the client side for a certain web control. So for example, if we would enable auto postback on a drop-down list, we'd need an event handler for that. The same with a submit button. When we click the submit button, we need an on-click event handler. So I'm going to double-click the button because that way Studio will help me by creating a shell in our code behind file to help manage that event handler. So we now have our button submit click event handler. So just to demonstrate what happens or when events occur, I'm going to put a write command in my file. I'll put response.write, and then in my text I'll put button clicked. and then I'm going to save my file, and I'm going to right click my web file and choose set as start page. And now when I go to the debug menu and choose start debugging, I can interact with my page. Now this is just a routine command that comes up to enable debugging. This always happens in Studio, and we can choose to modify the config file to enable debugging and choose yes, and then our page will load. And we'll see the controls. Now I didn't put anything in our drop-down list, so that's nothing to be concerned about. And when I click submit, it initiates a postback to the server, and the server writes the text button clicked into my page. To show you what happened on the client side, I'm going to right click and choose view source, and we'll see that ASP.NET generated dynamically all this HTML content. And here is where they wrote button clicked, and it's because with a response.write, it's not really interacting in a tight manner with the dynamic HTML being generated. It just outputs it to the browser. So in the sequence of events, the button click outputs that text, and then the HTML is rendered. And our web browser is just being forgiving and showing that text even though it's outside the HTML structure. As far as how the submit button appears, we can actually see that it made a HTML submit type tag. And in this case, it's not the ASP button that we started with, because that's not what you send to the client side. The same is true of the drop-down list. It's not an ASP drop-down list, it's a select tag. That's what renders from the server-side control in the browser. So we're always creating dynamic browser content, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, based on what we put in our server-side layout and in our server-side code. So now that we've established the basic page layout, we're going to add some drop-down list items to our select statement. One way to do this is to define them in code in the page load event. So if you remember, I named my drop-down list DDL season, and autocomplete of Studio is looking at anything available to this page, and it found DDL season. So I just hit tab to bring that out of the list, or I could just type DDL season. And then when you hit the period character, it brings up a list of methods and properties. So I know myself that drop-down lists have an items collection, and that an items collection has an add method. So you can always add methods to a drop-down list in code. And I'm doing this in the page load event, which means that when the page itself is actually bound to the controls on that page, then the drop-down list will have items added to it dynamically. So you can define a list item object and set properties like text and value, and then add the object as a parameter, or you can actually have a second overloaded option where you can just type a string value, and that just represents the name value in a simpler way. So what we're going to put is winter as our first season, and then I'll type DDL season items add spring, and DDL season items add summer. And now I'm going to add fall, but I'll do it using the object-based method we talked about before. So I'll just put here demonstrates adding list item object. So then what I need to do is define a new list item. And I'll just call this LST fall equals new list item. And the next thing I'll do is set properties of my list fall object. So I'll set the text equals to fall, and I'll set the value equals to fall. The value, of course, is what actually is sent to the web server. The text is what you see in the drop-down list. And of course, now that I've defined that list item, I need to add it to my drop-down list. So I'll type DDL season items add list fall. And I'll save my file. I'll go back to debug. I'll start debugging.